Welcome to Spotlight Murder by Scoob, and I'm your host, Kieran Caldwell. Picture this. It's May 4th, 2001, a cool Los Angeles evening. Studio City, California. An aging television star and his wife of just 6 months finished dinner at Vitello's Italian restaurant. They walk to their black 1991 Dodge Stealth, parked on a quiet side street, about a block and a half away. The car sits near a construction area, behind a dumpster, under a burned-out street lamp. It's around 9:30 p.m. when they leave the restaurant. But then, something happens. The husband suddenly remembers. He's left his handgun inside the restaurant. He tells his wife to wait in the passenger seat, window rolled down, while he rushes back inside to retrieve it. When he returns, his wife is slumped over, bleeding heavily. She's been shot, twice. One bullet through her head, another through her shoulder. He runs, frantic, pounding on a neighbor's door across the street, screaming that his wife needs help. The neighbor, Sean Stanek, grabs his phone and calls 911. In the background of that emergency call, you can hear the husband's distressed voice, trying to explain what happened. He then runs back to the restaurant, begging for a doctor or nurse. Someone comes back with him to help, but it's too late. 44-year-old Bonny Lee Bakley is pronounced dead shortly after paramedics arrive. And just like that, Hollywood has another scandal, another murder mystery, because the husband, he's Robert Blake, Emmy award-winning television star, former child actor, and now the prime suspect in his own wife's murder. This is the story of Robert Blake and Bonny Lee Bakley, a tale of fame, dysfunction, violence, and one of the most controversial celebrity trials in American history. To understand how we got to that terrible night in May 2001, we need to go back, way back, to September 18th, 1933, when Michael James Gubitosi was born in Nutley, New Jersey. That baby would grow up to become Robert Blake. His parents were vaudeville performers, and in the late 1930s, they moved the family to Los Angeles, chasing dreams in the movie industry. Young Michael and his siblings became part of a family act called the Three Little Hillbillies. Sounds charming, right? But behind the curtain, life was anything but charming. Blake would later reveal the horrors of his childhood, severe physical and emotional abuse at the hands of his alcoholic father. He was locked in closets for long periods, forced to eat off the floor as punishment. These traumas, he said, shaped his personality and his reputation for being difficult and intense throughout his career. But the show had to go on. By age 6, little Michael was already a fixture in Hollywood, appearing as Mickey in the Our Gang comedy shorts. You might know them as the Little Rascals. He changed his professional name to Bobby Blake and became a prolific child actor, appearing in dozens of films. He played Little Beaver in the Red Ryder Western series and had a memorable small role in the 1948 classic, The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, where he sold a winning lottery ticket to Humphrey Bogart. Like many child stars, Blake struggled to transition into adult roles. After serving in the United States Army, he returned to Hollywood and slowly rebuilt his career, this time focusing on intense, gritty performances. His breakthrough came in 1967 when he played real-life killer Perry Smith in Cold Blood, based on Truman Capote's book. Critics praised him for bringing a chilling sense of reality to the role, but his biggest success? That came in the 1970s with the police drama Beretta. Playing the streetwise detective Tony Beretta, Blake became a household name and won an Emmy Award in 1975. He was at the peak of his career, beloved by audiences across America. In his personal life, Blake married actress Sandra Kerr in 1961. They had 2 children, Noah and Delina, and stayed married for over 20 years before divorcing in 1983. After that, Blake spent many years as a bachelor, often describing himself as lonely and detached from Hollywood. That loneliness would eventually lead him to a jazz club in Burbank in 1999, where he would meet a woman who would change and ultimately end his life as he knew it. Bonny Lee Bakley was not your typical Hollywood hopeful. She had a reputation, She was known for sending letters and photos to famous men, trying to get close to celebrities. By the time she met Robert Blake at that jazz club in 1999, she had already been married 9 times. Their connection started casually. Within a few months, Bakley was pregnant. But here's where it gets complicated. She was involved with another man at the same time, Christian Brando, son of legendary actor Marlon Brando. She initially claimed Christian was the father and even named the baby Christian Shannon Brando at birth. Blake wasn't having it. He demanded a DNA test. When the results came back proving he was the father, the baby's name was legally changed to Rose Lenore Sophia Blake. Now, most love stories would have a romantic turn here. This one, not so much. Blake agreed to marry Bakley in November 2000, but first he made her sign a custody agreement. And it wasn't a standard agreement, it was extreme. It gave him monitored visits with their daughter and required written permission for visits from her family and friends. Bakley's own attorney warned her the agreement was unfair, but she signed it anyway. She wanted to marry a Hollywood star. What followed was one of the strangest marriages you could imagine. They never lived together. Bakley stayed in a small guest house on Blake's property with baby Rose. Blake remained in his main home. They kept a clear boundary between them, physically and emotionally. Blake was deeply distrustful of Bakley. He hired a private investigator to look into her past, concerned about her history of running Lonely Hearts scams and various schemes. Their interactions weren't marked by affection or partnership. They were marked by disagreement, suspicion, and constant conflict. Arguments were frequent. They fought about trust, money, and Bakley's attempts to maintain attention on herself rather than focusing on their family. Blake tried to enforce that extreme custody agreement, requiring written permission for her family to visit their daughter. Bakley resisted. The disputes were constant. Who could see the baby, where they could go? Neighbors reported hearing loud arguments. They saw the couple act coldly toward each other in public. Bakley rarely left the guest house and continued behaviors that made Blake uncomfortable. He tried to limit her influence over their daughter. She pushed back. It was a constant push and pull, with neither side giving ground. Blake later admitted in interviews that he felt Bakley married him for fame and security, not love. He felt trapped with someone he didn't trust. Bakley, meanwhile, seemed focused on being married to a famous man, on fulfilling her own dreams of attention and celebrity connection. Friends described both of them as cautious and defensive, never showing real affection. Even simple daily interactions were filled with suspicion and frustration. Their marriage lasted only about 6 months. 6 months of hostility, mistrust, and tension. And that tension would set the stage for that tragic night at Vitello's restaurant. Let's go back to May 4th, 2001, and walk through what happened step by step, because the details matter. Blake and Bakley had dinner at Vitello's Italian restaurant in Studio City. After their meal, they walked to Blake's car, parked on that quiet side street. According to Blake, he suddenly realized he'd left his handgun at the restaurant. He went back inside to retrieve it, leaving Bakley alone in the passenger seat with the window rolled down. No one saw him return to the car. While Bakley sat waiting, someone shot her, at least twice. The wounds were devastating. One bullet through her head, another through her shoulder. She was bleeding heavily when Blake allegedly discovered her. He ran to Sean Stanek's house across the street, pounding on the door, begging him to call 911. The 911 call captured Blake's frantic voice in the background. After Stanek made the call, Blake ran back to the restaurant, asking if there was a doctor or nurse who could help. A woman identifying herself as a nurse came back with him, but Bakley was already dying. She was conscious at first, but could barely respond. Paramedics arrived and attempted to save her life, but she was pronounced dead shortly after being taken to the hospital. Now here's a crucial detail. Investigators later found a Walther pistol in a trash container near the car. It was a World War II-era German weapon with its serial number filed off. The bullets from that gun matched Bakley's wounds. But this wasn't the gun Blake said he'd left at the restaurant. This was the murder weapon. And the gun Blake supposedly went back for? That wasn't the weapon that killed her. No eyewitness saw the actual shooting. The murder happened quickly, on a street that normally wouldn't attract attention, just blocks from that familiar restaurant where the couple had just finished dinner. Bonny Lee Bakley's life ended at age 44, in the passenger seat of a parked car, in a quiet Los Angeles neighborhood, on what started as an ordinary evening. When police arrived at the scene, they immediately noticed something. The passenger window was halfway down. This meant the shooter could have fired without getting blood on themselves. 2 bullet casings were found inside the car. The investigation began in earnest. Detectives were under enormous pressure. This was a celebrity case, and they couldn't afford another public embarrassment like the O.J. Simpson trial. They needed to be thorough, meticulous, and careful. The murder weapon, that Walther pistol with the scratched-off serial number, was actually found later in a dumpster near the crime scene, after police had already towed the car to a secure location. The gun was oiled and appeared to be a collector's item. Detectives immediately questioned why a killer would leave such an important piece of evidence behind. They looked at every angle. Bakley had a complicated past. Fraud, mail-order scams, relationships with multiple men. Some people from her past were questioned to see if someone might have wanted revenge. Police explored whether any of Blake's acquaintances could have been involved, including his bodyguard and handyman, Earl Caldwell, who had been close to him for years. But here's what raised red flags: Robert Blake's own behavior during questioning. At the North Hollywood police station, Blake refused a lie detector test, saying he was too tired. Detectives noticed something strange. He never asked what had happened to Bakley, how she was killed, or if she was alive. He didn't use her cell phone to call 911. When questioned about the delay in getting medical attention, his answers seemed off, leaving officers suspicious. A gunshot residue test was performed on Blake. It came back showing only a tiny amount of residue. Forensic experts later testified that if Blake had fired the gun, the residue would have been more than 20 times what the test detected. The investigation became increasingly detailed. Police collected hundreds of pieces of evidence: letters, phone records, statements from more than 150 people who knew the couple. They examined Blake's behavior, his financial dealings, his interactions with Bakley. They noted the marriage had been tense. Some of Bakley's family members openly believed Blake was responsible and refused to attend her funeral at Forest Lawn, convinced he had killed her. Early on, police explored other suspects. Christian Brando's name came up. He had known Bakley, after all, but there was no evidence connecting him to the murder, and he wasn't even in Los Angeles at the time. Investigators ruled him out. Every lead that didn't involve Blake was investigated and ultimately dismissed. The murder weapon itself became a crucial puzzle piece. Police tried to trace its origin, but with the serial number removed, the gun couldn't be linked to anyone. The fact that it was left at the crime scene suggested either the killer wanted it found or hadn't planned carefully. But then investigators uncovered something damning. Blake had allegedly discussed plans to get rid of Bakley with his bodyguard, Caldwell, and other associates. The prosecution would later argue Blake had motives: unhappiness in the marriage, financial concerns, that, combined with other evidence, made him the central figure in the case. Police continued gathering evidence: credit card statements, phone logs, emails. They interviewed neighbors, restaurant staff, friends. They worked on connecting Blake to the weapon and the planning of the murder. Nearly a year after the murder, on April 18, 2002, Robert Blake was arrested at his home in Studio City. By that time, police had concluded that all other possible suspects had been eliminated. Detectives said they were confident Blake was the only person who could have committed the crime based on motive, opportunity, and circumstantial evidence. The stage was set for one of the most watched celebrity trials in history. The criminal trial of Robert Blake became a media sensation. It stretched on for months, with more than 100 witnesses called by both sides. Prosecutors painted a dark picture. They claimed Blake was so obsessed with getting full custody of his daughter Rose that he plotted to have Bakley killed. They said Blake had asked as many as 5 people to kill his wife before the shooting and was willing to pay for it. Their star witnesses? 2 Hollywood stuntmen who testified that Blake talked to them about helping kill Bakley. Gary McLarty said Blake offered him money to pop Bakley and even discussed places and ways to do it. Another stuntman said Blake raised the idea during meetings and suggested various scenarios. According to prosecutors, these testimonies showed Blake wasn't just involved in the shooting, he had planned it in advance. They argued he wanted Bakley out of the way so he could have sole custody of Rose, but Blake's defense team had a different story. They argued the entire case was built on weak evidence and unreliable witnesses. They reminded the jury that no eyewitness saw Blake kill Bakley. There was no clear scientific proof tying the murder weapon directly to him. The small amount of gunshot residue on his hands could easily have come from the gun he carried for protection that night, not from firing the murder weapon. The defense spent considerable time discrediting the stuntmen and other prosecution witnesses. They showed these witnesses had histories of drug use and credibility problems, including hallucinations and legal troubles. Some had used cocaine or methamphetamine. The defense argued their statements couldn't be trusted. They challenged every part of the prosecution's case, saying there was no direct evidence Blake shot Bakley, or that he'd even been near the murder weapon when it was fired. They said prosecutors had built their case on stories rather than solid facts. Blake did not testify in his own defense during the criminal trial. His lawyers urged the jury to focus on the lack of real evidence, the holes in the prosecution's case. After months of testimony, the jury began deliberations, and when they came back, they delivered a stunning verdict: not guilty of murder, not guilty on 1 count of solicitation of murder. They couldn't reach agreement on a second solicitation charge, so the judge dismissed it. Blake trembled and sobbed when the verdicts were read on March 16, 2005. The jury foreman later said they simply couldn't connect all the links in the prosecution's case. They couldn't put the gun in Blake's hands at the time of the shooting. The prosecution had failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Blake did it. Robert Blake walked out of the courtroom a free man. But the story wasn't over. In November 2005, months after the criminal acquittal, Bonny Lee Bakley's children filed a civil wrongful death lawsuit against Robert Blake. Here's the thing about civil trials. They work differently from criminal trials. In a criminal trial, prosecutors must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a very high standard. In a civil trial, lawyers only need to show it's more likely than not that the person was responsible. It's a lower burden of proof. The civil jury heard many of the same arguments about Blake's behavior and motives. They heard testimony suggesting Blake may have had a plan to harm Bakley, and that he'd expressed willingness to see her dead. They heard about his actions that night, leaving her in the car, returning to the restaurant. This time, Blake testified. And according to his own lawyer, it didn't go well. His lawyer later said jurors hated him on the stand, and that this reaction may have played a part in their decision. The civil jury believed Blake was responsible for Bakley's death under that lower civil standard of proof. They ordered him to pay $30 million in damages to Bakley's children. Think about that. Blake had been acquitted of murder in criminal court, but found liable for causing her death in civil court. Same person, same death, 2 different outcomes. It's not as contradictory as it sounds. The different standards of proof make it possible for both verdicts to exist. The $30 million judgment devastated Blake financially. In 2006, he filed for bankruptcy, listing millions of dollars in debts. An appeals court later reduced the amount, but the civil finding of liability stood and affected him for years. After the trials, Robert Blake lived a quiet, largely private life in Los Angeles. In 2017, he married for a 3rd time, to Pamela Hudak, a longtime friend and supporter during his trial. But that marriage lasted only 2 years. Blake spent much of his time away from the spotlight, though he occasionally did interviews where he remained adamant about his innocence. He worked on reconciling with his youngest daughter, Rose, who had been raised by other family members after her mother's death. Robert Blake died on March 9th, 2023, at the age of 89. He left behind a legacy defined as much by his legal battles and personal hardships as by his early start as a child star and his peak as a television icon. So, what do we really make of the Robert Blake story? A child star shaped by abuse, fame, and trauma. A man who rose to stardom, only to see his personal life collapse into suspicion, secrecy, and tragedy. His marriage to Bonny Lee Bakley was volatile from the start, marked by mistrust, separation, and constant conflict. Then came one quiet night in May 2001. A parked car, gunshots, and a woman dead. The criminal court said not guilty. The civil court said liable. Blake maintained his innocence, but the question remains, if he didn't do it, then who did? No one was ever convicted. The case remains officially unsolved. What's left behind is a legacy forever shadowed by doubt, a child without a mother, and a truth that still feels just out of reach. And here's the unsettling part. There are details, contradictions, and overlooked moments that make this case even darker than it seems. To uncover the full story, download the Scoob app now and listen to the complete episode. Some stories don't end when the trial does, and this is one of them.